1018. The day my civilization scanners finally lied to us, I was standing in a room with a human woman who had been waiting 40 years for me to arrive. She did not look surprised to see me. She looked the way a person looks when they have rehearsed a moment so many times that the moment itself feels like memory. No fear, no triumph, just the small, terrible patience of someone who had always known I was coming. My name is Karen Valetorin. I was, until that day, third seat of the outer Concord diplomatic wing. I had delivered annexation notices to 17 species across 41 star systems. I had never been wrong about what I would find when I arrived. This is the real story of the day the Vorthak Ascendancy met humanity's Armageddon fleet, and the day my people learned that the oldest weapon in any war is the one you bring against yourself without knowing it. To understand what happened at Ceres, you have to understand what the galaxy looked like before humans arrived in it. The Vorthak Ascendancy had been the dominant diplomatic power in this arm of the galaxy for nearly 800 years. We had absorbed 47 species in that time. Not one of those absorptions had required a war. Our method was elegant. We would identify a developing civilization, classify it by tier, and approach it with what we called the gentle offer. Submit to Concord oversight, accept the protections of our scanner network, contribute to the shared economy, and in return, receive everything our older civilization had learned about how to survive. Most species accepted within a generation. Those who refused were not attacked. They were simply left to discover, over the following centuries, what it meant to exist outside the network. They almost always came back. The Vorthak did not consider this conquest. We considered it parenthood. Our scanner network was the engine of everything. 300,000 orbital platforms, distributed across the explored arm, capable of reading the heat signature of any industrial activity larger than a small city. We could count every shipyard in a system from 12 light-years away. We could measure the rate of expansion of any developing species and predict, within a decade, when they would be ready to receive the gentle offer. The network had been infallible for 800 years. Nobody questioned it. Nobody had ever needed to. And then the network told us about humans. The data was clear and uncontroversial. Humanity had achieved spaceflight late, expanded slowly, and built modestly. They had 12 warships of meaningful capability. Their industrial output was concentrated in 3 star systems and growing at a predictable rate. Their internal politics were fractured, which meant they could not be expected to mount coordinated resistance to anything. They were, in every classification our xenologists used, a Tier 4 developing civilization. The Concord scheduled the gentle offer for their 42nd year of confirmed contact. I was assigned to deliver it. I prepared for the assignment the way I prepared for all of them. I studied human history, human languages, human customs. I built mental models of what their leadership would say when I arrived. I expected curiosity, defensiveness, eventually acceptance. I expected to be home within a month. I did not expect to be standing in a room in the Ceres belt, watching the rock around me begin to open like an eye that had been closed for 40 years. The Concord's records on humans were thorough. They were also, I now understand, the most expensive lie my civilization has ever told itself. Humans had emerged from a single planet, achieved orbital flight roughly 2 centuries before our first observation, and reached interstellar capability within 90 years of that. This was considered fast by some xenologists and unremarkable by others. They had colonized 7 star systems by the time we began watching them in earnest. Their drives were primitive fusion designs, inefficient and slow. Their weapons were derivative of designs the Concord had seen across dozens of other developing species. There was nothing exceptional about them. What our reports did note, in the careful language xenologists use when they do not want to commit to a conclusion, was that humans had a strange relationship with catastrophe. They had survived on their home world multiple events that should have ended them: plagues, wars, climate collapse. They had repeatedly come within measurable distance of self-extinction, and then somehow declined to extinguish themselves. The xenologists noted this pattern. They did not know what to do with it. The senior analysts dismissed it as statistical luck. Every species that survives long enough to be observed has, by definition, survived. The fact that humans had survived more than most was treated as a curiosity, not a warning. One junior analyst, a Vorthak named Tess Calierman, wrote a paper suggesting that humans had developed an unusual cultural tolerance for long-term planning under existential threat. The paper was archived without circulation. Calierman was reassigned to a different department. I read that paper later, after series. It was the only honest document my civilization had produced about humans in 40 years. The pattern was there. Anyone could have seen it. We chose not to. The decision that built the Armageddon fleet was not made in a council chamber. It was made in the wreckage of a colony called Kepler Hollow. On the day, a rogue scavenger fleet from outside the Conquered's territory burned the colony to ash. This was 41 years before I arrived at Ceres. The scavengers were not Vorthak. They were not anyone we had records of. They appeared, attacked, and left, taking what they wanted from a human colony that had no defense capable of stopping them. The Conquered registered the event on our scanners. We sent a formal note of condolence. We did not send ships. There were 312,000 humans on Kepler Hollow when the attack began. There were 19 survivors when it ended. Those 19 made it to a recovery vessel and were eventually returned to Earth. One of them was a woman named Sarah Okonkwo. She was 26 years old. She had been a junior engineer on the colony's orbital infrastructure team. She had watched her husband die in the first 6 minutes of the attack. She had spent the next 4 days hiding in a maintenance shaft, listening to the scavengers move through the colony above her, looking for survivors to take. When Okonkwo returned to Earth, she did not speak publicly about Kepler Hollow. She did not appear in any of the memorial broadcasts. She submitted a single technical report to the United Earth Defense Council, and then, for 2 years, said almost nothing at all. The council assumed she was processing trauma. They assigned her a counselor and a desk job and let her be. What Okonkwo was actually doing during those 2 years was reading. She read every technical specification the council had on file. She read every report on the scavenger attack. She read the Conquered's public communications about the event, including the note of condolence, which she kept in a drawer in her quarters, and which was found there decades later by the historians who would eventually try to understand her. She read, and she thought, and she drew conclusions. At the end of those 2 years, she requested a meeting with the United Earth Defense Council. She presented a plan. The plan was not a weapon. The plan was a system that would, given enough time, produce weapons faster than anyone watching could possibly count them. She asked for 40 years and the worthless asteroid belt around Ceres. The council, to its credit, did not ask her why. They simply asked her how soon she could begin. She began the following month. The first hollowed asteroid was a piece of rock 14 kilometers across, designated 1972 Vance by the Old Human Catalog. It had no value. It contained no useful minerals. The Conquered scanners had logged it as inert background mass for a century and would continue to log it that way for 40 years more. Okonkwo's first principle was simple, and she stated it to her first crew on the day they began work. Rock blocks heat. Rock blocks scanning. If we work inside the rock, no one will see us working. The corollary, which she did not state but which everyone understood, was that the moment anyone could see them working, the work would be stopped. The hollowing process took 18 months for the first asteroid. The crews worked in shifts, melting the interior with industrial drills, pumping the molten waste out through carefully shielded vents that released their heat slowly enough to mimic natural geological activity. The Conquered scanners registered the asteroid as warm. They did not register it as occupied. Inside the rock, Okonkwo built her first shipyard. It produced its first vessel, a small destroyer-class frigate named Kepler's Answer, in the third year of the project. The frigate was never launched. Okonkwo had no intention of launching anything yet. The frigate was a proof of concept. It demonstrated that the system worked. It was placed in cold storage inside the asteroid, where it would wait, along with everything that came after it, for the day Okonkwo had not yet named. By the 5th year, there were 4 hollowed asteroids. By the 10th year, there were 19. By the 20th year, the belt contained 247 hollowed asteroids, each one a shipyard, each one shielded from the Concord's scanners by kilometers of dead rock. The belt was producing 1 warship every 9 days and storing them all. The humans called the project in their private documents the Long Patience. They did not give it a public name. The public did not know it existed. In the 14th year of the project, Sarah Okonkwo was 64 years old and beginning to show the strain of a life spent inside rock. She had built a system that worked, but she was not, by her own honest assessment, the right person to run it at scale. Industrial sprawl was not what the Long Patience needed anymore. It needed coordination. It needed doctrine. It needed someone who could think about the belt not as a collection of shipyards, but as a single instrument with one purpose. She found that person in a logistics theorist from Guadalajara, named Yusuf Mendoza. Mendoza had spent his career studying the supply chains of pre-spaceflight human empires. He had written a book about the Roman grain trade that almost no one had read but which Okonkwo had read twice. She brought him to Ceres, showed him what she had built, and asked him if he could turn it into a fleet. Mendoza spent 6 months walking through the hollowed asteroids before he gave her an answer. When he gave it in writing, in a document that ran 400 pages, and which the historians later called the Mendoza Doctrine. The doctrine was, in essence, a method for converting Okonkwo's industrial sprawl into a coordinated military instrument that could be activated, deployed, and commanded as a single force. The doctrine specified rotation schedules for crew. It specified supply chains that could not be interrupted by the loss of any single asteroid. It specified communication protocols that used the rock itself as a signal medium, sending messages through vibrations that no scanner network could read. It specified, with brutal clarity, how many ships would be needed to defeat which categories of enemy, and how the belt should prioritize production to ensure that all categories were covered. Under Mendoza, the Long Patience reached its true peak. By the 30th year of the project, the belt held more than 3,000 warships in cold storage. By the 35th year, it held nearly 4,000. The Concorde scanners continued to register the belt as inert background mass. The Concorde xenologists continued to classify humans as a Tier 4 developing civilization. The Concorde scheduled the gentle offer for the 42nd year. The Concorde assigned the assignment to me. Mendoza died in the 37th year, of natural causes, in his quarters inside an asteroid he had never left for the last decade of his life. He was buried, at his request, in the rock he had spent his career hollowing out. His doctrine remained. The fleet he had organized remained. The day he had been preparing for remained on the horizon somewhere, getting closer. What was daily life actually like inside the belt? The question is harder to answer than it sounds, because the people who lived inside the belt did not write about it. They did not write about anything. Silence was the central condition of their lives. By the 30th year of the project, the belt's population was approaching 400,000. Most of them had been born inside the asteroids. They had never seen a sky. They had never stood on a planet's surface. They knew the outside world only through carefully filtered information that arrived through Mendoza's communication network, edited to remove anything that might compromise the secrecy of what they were building. The culture that developed inside the belt was unlike anything else in human history. It was a culture of inheritance. Children were raised to understand that they were building something they would not finish. They were taught to take pride in the contribution rather than the completion. They learned, before they learned to read, that the day was coming and that no one knew when, and that the only honorable response to that uncertainty was to keep building. There were taverns inside the belt. There was music. There were marriages and funerals and births, and the slow accumulation of small human things that any community generates over time. The tavern served alcohol distilled from yeast cultures grown in the asteroid's interior gardens. The music was performed live because no recordings were allowed to leave the belt, and the people inside it preferred to make their own anyway. The funerals were conducted in the rock. The bodies sealed into walls of the asteroids the dead had spent their lives hollowing. The central cultural rule, the one every child learned without anyone having to state it, was that the work was not for them. The work was for someone who had not arrived yet. When that person arrived, the work would be revealed. Until then, the work continued, and the people doing the work asked no questions about when the day would come, because asking the question would have made the day harder to wait for. These were not, by most measures, free people. They had limited contact with the outside world. They had no realistic option to leave. They had inherited a mission they had not chosen, but within the belt, they had built something that the rest of human civilization had not managed to build in any of its other settlements. They had built a community whose entire purpose was directed toward a single distant moment, and which had organized itself, generation after generation, to be ready for that moment when it came. That is not nothing. No history of the long patience is complete without the people who shaped it from the inside. There were three whose names the historians would eventually surface, and whose stories, taken together, explain what kind of place the belt actually was. The first is Captain Rhea Vance. In the 19th year of the project, Vance was 28 years old, a junior officer with a reputation for taking risks her superiors disapproved of. The Concord had begun deploying long-range survey probes through the outer human systems. Gathering data of the belt's secrecy depended on misreading. Vance proposed, in a private memo to her commanding officer, that she be allowed to capture one of the probes and bring it to the belt for study. The proposal was, by every standard of careful operation Mendoza had established, insane. A failed capture would alert the Concord to the existence of resistance. A successful capture would alert the Concord to the existence of capability. The risk was unacceptable. Vance executed the capture anyway, alone, in a stealth craft she had modified herself, 2 weeks after her memo was rejected. She brought the probe back to the belt intact. The Concord registered the loss as a malfunction. Vance was court-martialed in a closed proceeding, found guilty, and quietly promoted 6 months later because the probe she had captured gave the belt 3 years of scanner data that allowed Mendoza to identify and eliminate the last weaknesses in the belt's concealment. Vance became a legend inside the belt, and a name no one outside it would hear for 2 decades. The second is Colonel Dmitry Kozlov. Kozlov ran the belt's internal security from the 22nd year until his death in the 38th. He was, by every account that survives, a hard man. He believed with a clarity that disturbed even Mendoza that the survival of the long patience depended on the absolute prevention of leaks, and that any cost paid to prevent leaks was justified by the cost of the leak itself. In his 16 years as head of internal security, Kozlov identified 3 workers who had begun making preparations to defect. He did not allow any of them to leave. He did not bring them to trial. He executed all 3 personally, and recorded the executions in his own internal logs, which were not declassified until long after the events of series. The logs make clear that Kozlov did not enjoy what he did. They also make clear that he did it anyway, and that he believed until the day he died that he had saved more lives than he had taken. The third is Marshal Elena Reyes. Reyes took command of the Armageddon fleet in the 39th year of the project, 3 years before I arrived. She had grown up inside the belt. Her parents had both worked on the hollowing of asteroid 408. She had never seen the sky of Earth. She had been chosen for command not because she was the most experienced strategist available, but because She was the one who had spent her entire life waiting for the day, and who understood, in a way that no one raised outside the belt could understand, exactly what the day was supposed to mean. It was Reyes who chose the day. It was Reyes who decided that the next conquered envoy to arrive would be the one who saw the truth. I am the envoy she chose. I did not know I had been chosen until I was already in the room. Step back from the individual people and look at what the humans had actually built. The long patience was not, in any honest sense, a weapon. A weapon is a thing you build to use. The Armageddon fleet was a thing the humans had built to never need to use, but to have ready, in case the day arrived when use became unavoidable. It was an insurance policy written in steel and stored in rock, 40 years of premiums paid into an account that no one wanted to draw on. The tragedy of the Vorthak ascendancy is that we made the policy necessary. We made it necessary the day the Kepler hollow scavengers came, and we sent a note of condolence instead of ships. We made it necessary every year afterward when our scanners told us humanity was small, and our analysts told us humanity was Tier 4, and our diplomats prepared the gentle offer that humans had no reason to accept, and every reason to prepare for. We made the belt necessary by being exactly what we had always been, a gentle parent civilization that assumed gentleness would be received as gentleness. The humans had drawn a different conclusion from Kepler hollow. They had concluded that gentleness was not enough, and that no one, not the Vorthak, not the scavengers, not anyone, could be trusted to come to their aid in the moment that aid was needed. They had concluded that the only protection that mattered was the protection a civilization built for itself, in secret, over generations, against a day it could not predict. They were not wrong. That is the part that took me longest to accept in the years I spent reconstructing what had happened. They were not wrong. The conquered had not protected them. The conquered would not have protected them. The conquered had scheduled their annexation and called it a gift. This is the contradiction at the center of the long patience, and there is no clean version of it. The humans built a fleet capable of breaking my civilization. They built it because we gave them no other option. They were not innocent in what they had built. We were not innocent in why they had built it. The honest reading of what happened at Ceres is that two civilizations had spent 40 years preparing for a moment, and only one of them had understood that the moment was coming. That is the story. The rest is just the day it ended. I arrived at Ceres on the standard schedule, with the standard diplomatic credentials, expecting the standard meeting. The belt had prepared a reception facility on the surface of one of the asteroids. The facility was modest, almost crude, the kind of structure that confirmed every assumption my civilization had made about the humans' industrial limits. I noted, in the diplomatic report I was already composing in my head, that the reception facility was consistent with Tier 4 classification. I noted this approvingly. I noted that the assignment would, as expected, be completed within the month. Marshal Elena Reyes met me in the receiving hall. She was a small woman, gray-haired, with the kind of stillness I had only ever seen in very old Vorthak. She greeted me in formal conquered protocol, accepted my credentials, and invited me to deliver the gentle offer. I delivered it. I read the standard text. I explained the protections the conquered would extend to humanity, the contributions humanity would make to the shared economy, the timeline over which the integration would occur. I was professional. I was thorough. I was, by every metric of diplomatic performance, doing my job exactly as I had been trained to do it. Reyes listened without interrupting. When I had finished, she did not respond to what I had said. She asked me instead if I would like to see something. I said I would. She walked me to a viewport at the far end of the reception hall and asked me to look out at the belt. The viewport faced an asteroid roughly 2 kilometers across. I had seen the asteroid on the approach to the facility. It had registered on every scanner my ship carried as inert background mass. I looked at it. I looked at Reyes. She nodded once to someone I could not see, and the asteroid began to open. I have spent a long time trying to describe what I saw in the next 30 minutes, and I have not yet found language adequate to the task. The rock split along seams I had not been able to see. The interior of the asteroid was hollow, and the hollow was full of warships, hundreds of them. I watched the first wave move out into open space, and then I watched the second asteroid open, and the third and the fourth, and I understood, somewhere around the 20th asteroid, that I was not watching the belt show me one of its hidden installations. I was watching the belt show me itself. 4,000 warships emerged from rock my civilization's scanners had registered as empty for 4 decades. They formed up in coordinated formations Mendoza had designed 30 years before. They moved with the precision of a fleet that had drilled for this moment in simulation for as long as any of its officers had been alive. I did not file my report. I did not finish my report. I had been composing it in my head all morning, and at some point during the second hour of watching the belt activate, the report stopped composing itself. The diplomatic phrases I had been trained to use did not apply to what I was seeing. The classification system I had been trained to use did not contain a category for it. I turned to Reyes. I asked her quietly what humanity wanted. She told me. The conversation that followed lasted 6 hours. I will not record it here. The terms humanity asked for were not unreasonable. They were not, by any measure my civilization would have used the day before, what we would have agreed to. By the time the conversation ended, we had agreed to all of them. I returned to the Concord with the terms. The Concord ratified them within the week. The gentle offer was withdrawn from the diplomatic record. The classification of humans as Tier 4 was withdrawn. The scanner network was, over the following years, quietly rebuilt to acknowledge what it had failed to see, although by then the acknowledgement was a formality. Everyone in the Concord knew what we had failed to see. The records were updated to make the failure official. I am old now, by Vorthak standards. I have spent the years since series trying to understand what happened, not as a diplomatic event, but as a lesson my civilization had refused to learn for 800 years, and finally had no choice but to learn in a single afternoon. The lesson is not that humans are dangerous. The lesson is not even that humans are patient, although they are, in a way my species has only begun to appreciate. The lesson is about what happens when a powerful civilization assumes that the species it considers small will remain small forever, and arranges its policies accordingly. The smaller species learns. The smaller species adapts. The smaller species, given enough time and enough motivation, builds something the powerful civilization cannot see, because the powerful civilization has stopped looking. The Armageddon fleet was never a weapon. I understand this now in a way I did not understand it the day I stood at the viewport. It was a letter. 40 years in the writing, sealed in rock, addressed to whoever arrived at the belt assuming that humans were small. The letter said, in language that did not require words, that the humans had noticed what we thought of them, and that they had organized their entire civilization around the assumption that we would never change our minds, and that they had been right. The Concord no longer classifies species by tier. We classify them by what they have chosen to build, and by what they have chosen not to build, and by the reasons behind both choices. It is a slower system. It produces fewer annexations. It produces, so far as I can tell, almost no enemies. The historians of my species have begun to write about the 800 years before Ceres as the tiered era, and about the years after as something for which they have not yet agreed on a name. I think about Sarah Okonkwo sometimes. I think about her sitting in her quarters on Earth in the years after Kepler Hollow, reading the Concord's note of condolence, drawing the conclusions that would shape the next 40 years of her life. I do not think she hated us. I do not think hatred is the right word for what she felt. I think she understood us, in a way we had not yet learned to understand ourselves, and I think she built what she built because understanding required it. Humanity did not win its series by being stronger than us. They were not, even at the end, stronger than the full Concord. They won by being patient enough to be underestimated for 40 years and never once correcting the record. They won by building in silence, the thing we had assumed they could not build. They won in the end because we taught them that no one would protect them, and they believed us, and they acted on the belief. The asteroid that opened first that day is still there. The humans left it open. They use it now as a museum, although almost no one outside the belt has ever visited it. The interior is empty. The warships have been redistributed across the human territories, where they continue to serve, although they have never been used in anger. The asteroid stands as what the humans call a reminder to themselves of what they built, a reminder to the rest of us of what we made them build. I have walked through it once. The rock smells of old work and patient hands. The walls bear the markings of generations of laborers who carved their names where the warships used to rest. The names mean nothing to me individually. Together, they mean everything. For 40 years, on a useless belt of rock in a system my civilization had stopped looking at, the people we called small built something we could not see, against a day we did not know was coming, because we had given them every reason to expect it and none to expect anything else. They proved that the oldest weapon in the galaxy is the assumption that you have already understood your neighbor. They proved that condescension, given enough time, builds its own armies. They proved that even a species the universe has treated as a footnote can write, in patience and rock, a letter the rest of us will spend the rest of our history reading. That is not nothing. It may in the end be everything.